watch a clear sky be totally filled with these trails that just stay there?
Oh, I've counted in a couple times. I have counted over 100 passes. You can't say individual aircraft, but over 100 passes within a 2-hour period. They just blanket the sky and completely alter it. And so I started taking photographs and showed that progression for the very first time, that you had an unnatural situation that was taking place. And I simply opened the door by posting the photographs on the website and really just raised the issue. I mean, that's sort of my style. I wasn't trying to. I knew it was wrong. At a gut level, I knew it was wrong. At the very least, you would call this a question of pollution. And the website started, and at that point, it was fairly clear very soon that there was an interest in my work by military, industrial, chemical, pharmaceutical, medical, chemical complex. It was very shortly after you would find, and I was just an individual, really pretty low-key person. I was a quiet and conservative federal employee.
They were living on your website.
But I was drawing attention very early in the game because my work is more of an analytical nature, that's for sure. It's, observation and analysis, that's my background. And then it started from there, and from that point on, I started my work and ended up, I've spent a probably good 6 years. The past year, I have not been actively involved in research because I've reached really thresholds of what I can do. It does look like there's another subject I'm going to be getting involved in. But there are literally thousands of pages, I would assume, that I have written now over 6 years and devoted pretty much my entire life to this issue, to basically call alarm. That was my purpose, to call alarm. This is not something that is solved by a person. This is not something you
can look certainly. You're just alerting people to something strange going on. So when did this start? For me, about 97, 98, I began to notice that trails that disappeared within a minute maximum would be there 4 or 5 hours later. Clear skies would be turned into these trails that just expanded and merged, and then NASA comes out and says suddenly the Earth is 20% darker. Just on the weather control angle of this, what's going on?
Well, I did want to mention, as you said, there's a lot of things to this, and it's very true. And people do have a tendency to, I would say, either simplify it or avoid it because it's too complex, either or. And it is a complex issue, and over a period of 6-7 years, I have evolved to where there's about 7 areas that I think are involved in.
Well, let's run through the gamut, run the gauntlet with you on the other side. Clifford Carnicom, website's carnicom.com. We have a link to it up on Infowars.com. Just vital information that this man has done. So many other great researchers, but he was the trailblazer. We'll be right back.
Don't worry. This show is documented. Alex Jones on the GCN Radio Network.
I fell into a
bottom line, we know that condensation trails, growing up my entire life, my father's life, I've talked to grandparents when jet travel first began. Trails always disappear within a minute. My entire life. And then suddenly, the late 90s, they began to just hang there, expand, grow. So is the government blocking out the evil radiation from the sun, or are they engaging in mass inoculations? All these things have been said. Are they poisoning us? Well, we know in the past they have killed American citizens on purpose with admitted biological testing. And then we have all the admissions of low-altitude spraying. Clifford Carnicom, walk through the 7 different areas of your research and what you know, what you've tested, break it down for us, sir.
Thanks, Alex. This list was 5 up to about a year ago, and there's been 2 added that I haven't really written up, but I've added them to the list. Some of these can be shown to exist, at least with the best evidence we can. Some of them exist strictly through analysis. Basically, in my case, I have to look at the data and then ask, what would you do? If this set of data exists, what does that data portend, basically? And so I wouldn't call it conjecture by any means, but it's definitely a process of analysis. The 7 areas would be as follows. The first would be, and I would say that all of these, I would call them areas of operation that are consistent with all of the data that has been collected over 7 years. They do not exist individually. They exist simultaneously. They are. First one would be environmental modification and control, actually modifying our world in terms of its environment and weather. This would be the simplest and the easiest probably to understand and demonstrate. The second would be the conduct of biological operations, using particulates as a transport medium for biological materials. The third would be the application and use of electromagnetic operations, the transmission and propagation and manipulation of energy, electromagnetic energy, within a modified atmospheric environment. Let's see, the easiest analogy there would be the ionosphere. Think of the conditions of the ionosphere at altitude, which
some type of conductivity for HAARP or something.
Yeah, that's right. That medium. Think of that medium of the ionosphere being brought to a lower level around the Earth, basically. We can talk about each of these in more detail. The fourth would be military operations, defense, military, offensive, defense, and military operations. HAARP is certainly a main player. If you look at the thesis and patent of the HAARP facility, it fits like a glove with the actual data that exists for us now. The fifth is a little bit more esoteric, but still quite feasible to me. This would be one based on analysis, and that is a geophysical modification. Actually, the consideration of whether the planet itself, I'm not talking about just the atmosphere, but the geophysics of the Earth. You would be talking about rotation of the Earth, geophysical processes, tectonic, these type of things. And that may sound a little bit stretched for some folks, but the data actually suggests that such things could indeed be feasible to do. The last two are additions over the last year, which have not been written up. Number 6 would be surveillance, a surveillance operation. The idea there being, most of us are familiar with radar, and radar is when you send a radio wave out and it bounces off of something, comes back and tells you something's there. Well, what's interesting is radar works because the objects that you're detecting are of a certain size. It has to do with the wavelength of what you're sending out has to match what it is you're looking for. So radio works with radar for airplanes and big objects. But there is an alternative method of detection that involves light waves. And the wavelength of light waves is extremely small, very small. And in fact, it's at the same size as the particles that we're speaking of that compose these operations that are being introduced. So it's quite feasible that you actually could develop a surveillance system that would, instead of being able to track large objects, such as planes and boats and this type of thing, could track literally down to the microscopic level. And in the public admissions about HAARP, they say that it was designed to see tiny objects over the horizon. Exactly true. Exactly true. The HAARP patent it's just full. I've spent some time with that patent and didn't really know a lot about it when I started, but I've sort of dug into that on a technical side, and I'll tell you the overlap is just tremendous.
Now that's all the science on the end of it. Studying this, looking at it though, just speaking on your opinion, what do you think they're doing? Why? Well, number one, what is this doing to the atmosphere? What changes have we seen that can then point us towards what their goals may be?
Okay. The actual materials that are being identified over and over and over are what you would call ionizing salts. It's a very specific category of physics, and yet extremely important. The best explanation for what can physically transform the atmosphere in the way that they have is through the introduction of ionizable metallic salts. Now, what does that mean? And also of an extremely small size, down at the submicron level.
Isn't that similar to the nuclei they use to weather control?
You mean for cloud seeding? And that
yes.
Well, I would suspect, if we looked into the cloud seeding, and I could be mistaken, but I suspect the particles that we're dealing with would be a magnitude. Those are crystals we're talking about, in a conventional sense. The size of these is so incredibly small. Submicron, a human hair is 60 to 100 microns. A bacteria are on the order of 10 microns. What I'm speaking of is on the order of submicron, most likely. So the size of what you're talking about is truly a unique, let's say, represents a truly unique opportunity for physical change in terms of how clouds form and this type of thing.
Okay, please continue.
But this business of ionization appears to be extremely important. The materials that are being found, specific ones would be calcium magnesium and barium. My tests have repeatedly shown these. Barium is of tremendous concern here because it is a highly toxic element in soluble form. It's quite on par with arsenic in terms of its toxicity in soluble form. And what I'm speaking of would be in soluble form because you're dealing about clouds and moisture. These particular